Hey everyone, Robert here. Welcome back. This is part 3 of building your own Pocket platform. And in this part, we're going to turn the virtual private server into an SSL reverse proxy. Let me explain what that is and why it's useful. Generally speaking, when you push code from your laptop into production, there are 3 common categories of problems that occur. By far the most common one is bugs. But a second class of problems has to do with differences between the laptop and the production environment. And these differences can include environment variables, installed dependencies, CPU, RAM, disk. A third kind of difference occurs where the client has a different behavior, depending on whether it's pointed to localhost or publicly accessible URL. Let me show you. Suppose you open your browser, you've got some local changes running on port 3000 on your laptop, and you can open that by pointing your browser to localhost port 3000. But let's say that the application needs to make some API calls, and these API calls actually live at https api.app.com. Now it's very common for these API endpoints to enforce something called a CORS policy. So this stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. And this is a security policy that basically says this API is going to only accept requests coming from some known set of domains. So for example, the api.app.com CORS settings might say, I only accept requests that are coming from www.app.com. And that makes a lot of sense because you don't want to serve requests coming from any random URL. And the browser will help enforce this by taking the current URL and forwarding it on as the origin. Now, SSL reverse proxies can help you work around this because if you can somehow host all of the contents on localhost port 3000 at something like https dev.app.com, now those CORS settings still work. And you didn't need to relax the production CORS settings to make it happen. And the way this can work is as the request comes in https dev.app.com, we can use our VPS settings, the settings that we've configured in part 2 where we have the subdomain routing. We can have that routing those HTTP requests from the dev subdomain to some sort of proxy container. And this container is really simple. All this container is going to take the SSL terminated traffic coming in on port 80 and forward it back on some other port. And this can be whatever port we want. And to achieve this, SSH already has this built in. In fact, we can run SSH in reverse tunnel mode, and SSH will automatically forward all traffic from port 80 to some special reverse proxy port. And then in SSH, we can pass in the startup parameters to then forward that traffic back onto port 3000. And in that way, we can have the exact same thing showing up on localhost port 3000 as well as https dev.app.com. In addition to helping out with CORS, an SSL reverse proxy also makes it really easy to test your application changes from a mobile device and to share these changes with your teammates. And if you're working with something like an Alexa skill or a GitHub webhook, well, those integrations simply require that you work with an SSL endpoint. Now, when you're working with these kinds of SSL reverse proxies, you have to be careful about security, because if dev.app.com is a way to publicly access your untested changes, well, anybody can access them. You want to be careful about that. There are many ways to secure it. For example, you can include custom authentication and authorization at this special endpoint, or you can restrict access to this endpoint to a limited set of IP addresses, well-known IP addresses. All right, let's begin setting up our reverse proxy. As I showed in the diagram, we want to be able to access my changes on localhost. Here I have create React app, the boilerplate create React app running on localhost port 3000. And ideally, I want to be able to access it from some sort of publicly accessible SSL terminated URL, such as alpha.raccoon.news. And right now, this is not going to work because we don't have a reverse proxy container running. Right now, I see 503 service temporarily unavailable coming from Nginx, which is our subdomain routing container. That's fine. So the first step is to SSH into our virtual private server. I'm already SSH'd in here. If you forgot how to do this, check back in on part 1 of the video series. So I'm in my virtual private server now, and I'm going to run a few commands, and I'll explain each of these commands as I go along. the sake of saving myself some typing, I've placed all of the code that we need into this GitHub repo, and there will be a link in the description as well. Oops. Okay, once we're in this directory, there is a Docker file here. Let me highlight some things about this Docker file. The first is that you can see it takes a root password as an argument, and if you don't set anything, it's just going to use root. Pretty insecure. You probably want to replace that with something a little bit more secure. It's going to install Open SSH server. It's going to permit root login so that you can log in as root @ and therefore you can bind port 80, because you need to be logged in as root in order to bind port 80. Any other account, you can only bind high value ports. And we also enabled gateway ports. This is another needed line in the config file for this all to work. And down here we can see that we are changing the root password with the parameterized root password from above. Now all we need to do is come in here and I'll just set this to root as well for demo purposes. And now my container has been built. Now notice up here that I've named the container under my account, and I've called it dev proxy, and I've tagged it with a version tag of 0.0.1. This is optional. You can name this whatever you want. You can put it under your account on Docker Hub if you want to be able to upload and reuse it somewhere. And now what we need to do is actually run this container. And you can see this example code I've written here is that we're specifying virtual host and the Let's Encrypt host, both specifying dev.raccoon.news as the subdomain. The other thing we're doing is we are routing port 2222 to 22. That means that SSH connections made to port 2222 on the host virtual private server will instead be routed to port 22 within the proxy container. And in this way, this is how we distinguish between whether we're SSHing into the virtual private server itself or we're simply creating a reverse proxy SSH connection to the proxy container. So all I need to do is grab this command right here and run it. Now let's just check to see if our container is up and running. Indeed it is. Right here. And finally, in a new command window, I need to run this SSH command here. And what we're doing here is we're specifying we want to run SSH. We want to connect to port 2222, which remember in part 1 we exposed as a network port in the firewall rules. And then what we want to do is to route port 80 within the proxy container back to localhost port 3000 on which our create React app is running. And by the way, there are two command line switches here. The -r specifies that we want to run SSH in reverse tunnel mode so that we can route port 80 traffic to localhost port 3000. And then n basically says don't execute anything, and this is useful so that we can just keep it running. We don't actually want an interactive SSH session. We just want to run this command solely for the purpose of running this reverse tunnel. So I'm just going to grab this command right here and come into a new command window here and type this. Oops. Let me clean this up from a previous demo. Okay, and I set the password earlier. So now I should be SSH reverse proxied in. The reverse proxy connection is open. It's not going to do anything, as I said before. And now the test to see if it's all working. We can come back in here and it is dev.raccoon.news. There you go. And now I have dev.raccoon.news. SSL terminated. This is the SSL certificate. It's valid. Not giving me any warnings. And because it's create React app and it's running in dev mode right now, I should be able to come in here and change something in the app and see hot reloading take place. So let me just say, bam, look at that. So there you have it. SSL reverse proxy in just a couple commands And this is making full use of all the existing work that we did to turn our virtual private server into a Docker host that's capable of routing different subdomains to different containers.